If the giant woman reaches your door, Gideon, you will lose more than your ranch. The voice came through the telephone receiver in broken pieces, scraped thin by distance and mountain weather. Gideon stood beside the wall box while rain struck the roof like thrown gravel. "Who is this?" Only breathing answered. Then the line crackled. "She carries what should have stayed buried. Send her away before she opens it." A sharp click ended the call. Gideon kept the receiver against his ear for one more heartbeat. His thumb tapped twice against the wooden casing, the old habit that appeared whenever fear moved beneath his calm. Then 3 slow knocks sounded at the front door. Some warnings arrived early enough to change a life. Others only revealed the man a person had already become. What Copper Creek believed about the stranger outside was not the whole story, and neither was the guilt Gideon had carried for nearly 20 years. Stay until the end, because his choice that night would reach farther than either of them understood. Leave a like and share where you are watching from, so this old memory might travel as far as hers had. The knocking came again. Gideon crossed the room with the stiffness rain always drew into his right knee. He opened the door. The woman on the porch stood nearly eye to eye with him. Water streamed from long, light brown hair and darkened a faded blue dress. The sleeves had been torn away, revealing arms built like bridge beams beneath road dust and rain. One enormous hand held a battered trunk. The other pressed a dented tin box against her ribs. She looked exhausted, but not afraid. "Gideon Mercer?" Her voice was low and careful. "That is my name. I am Marenna Vale." Her fingers tightened around the box. "My father told me to place this in your hands before he died." The surname struck harder than thunder. Gideon stepped aside. "Come in." Marenna remained on the porch. "I did not come asking for charity. You came through 7 miles of rain. That does not make your roof my right." "No." Gideon held the door wider. "It makes shelter the decent thing." Her gray-green eyes searched his face for mockery or fear. She found neither. At last, she lifted the trunk as though it contained blankets and entered. The floorboards complained beneath her heavy boots. Gideon closed the door. Warmth from the iron stove gathered around them, carrying coffee, cedar smoke, and damp wool. Marenna set the trunk down gently. She kept the box in her arms. A mare cried from the barn. Marenna turned toward the sound. "Is she hurt?" "Cut her foreleg this morning. Nothing deep." The concern in her face came too quickly to be practiced. Gideon noticed that. He poured coffee into a tin cup. Marenna hesitated before accepting. Her fingers nearly swallowed it, yet she held it as carefully as a church candle. "Your father was Silas." It was not a question. Marenna rubbed the scar on her left palm with her thumb. "You remember him. I remember enough." Pain passed across her features. "He remembered you until the end." Gideon turned toward the stove before his face betrayed him. The cracked silver watch in his vest pocket felt suddenly heavier. Marenna placed the tin box on the table. It was old and blackened at the corners. Across the lid, someone had burned the brand of the North Fork Cattle Company. Gideon had not seen that twisted end and split antler in 18 years. His breath shortened. "The wagon broke an axle in the pass," Marenna murmured. "The driver left before dark. I walked from Miller Ridge." "With that trunk?" "With both. You should not have been abandoned." A faint, humorless smile touched her mouth. "People often decide my size means I do not require kindness." Gideon met her gaze. "People often mistake endurance for permission." For the first time, her expression softened. The storm pressed close around the house, but the silence between them changed. It no longer felt empty. It felt careful. Marenna opened the first latch. "I do not know everything inside." Father kept the key around his neck, even while sleeping. Before he died, he told me the box held the reason our family could never return to Copper Creek. The second latch resisted. She forced it with one thumb. Beneath folded papers lay an object wrapped in oilcloth. Marenna placed it between them, a carved cottonwood horse. One ear had broken away. A dark stain marked the tiny saddle. Along the belly, cut by an unsteady young hand, were two initials, G. M. Gideon stared at the toy he had carved during the worst winter of his life. Marenna studied his face. "You made this," his silence answered. She drew a brass key from beneath her collar. It fit a narrow lock hidden under the box rim. Before she turned it, the telephone rang. Once, twice, then a third time. Gideon looked from the black wall box to the cattle brand burned into the lid. Marenna kept her hand on the key. The telephone rang again. This time Gideon knew the caller was waiting to hear whether he would lie. Gideon crossed the room and lifted the receiver. Static whispered along the line. "Send her away before sunrise." The voice had changed its pitch, but not its bitterness. Gideon looked toward Marenna. She stood beside the table with one hand resting on the brass key, her face composed. "You know who she is?" the caller continued. "You know what her father carried for you." Gideon's grip tightened. "What do you want?" "A quiet grave for an old truth." The connection snapped. He returned the receiver to its hook. Marenna did not ask who had called. That restraint unsettled him more than suspicion would have. "You heard enough," he murmured. "I heard that someone feared the box, and you?" "I feared what my father became whenever he remembered this place." Rainwater still darkened her dress. Gideon added cedar to the stove. "You can take the spare room. I can sleep in the barn." "You will not." Marenna lifted one brow. That sounded less like hospitality. It was. For a moment, the corner of her mouth nearly rose. She turned the key, but the swollen compartment refused to open. Gideon placed a hand over the lid. "Not tonight." Her eyes hardened. "You have waited longer than I have." "Yes." The answer carried enough weight to stop her. The injured mare called again. Marenna glanced toward the door. "Let me look at her. You walked 7 miles through a storm." "I have walked farther for animals that trusted people less." Gideon handed her his oilskin coat. The barn smelled of hay, damp leather, and frightened horse sweat. The bay mare shifted in the stall, favoring her front leg. Gideon expected Marenna to approach with the confidence of someone who trusted her strength. Instead, she lowered herself to one knee. Her massive frame became still. She extended an empty palm and waited. The mare trembled. Marenna breathed slowly until the frantic rhythm eased. Only then did she touch the broad nose. "You were hurt," Marenna whispered. "That does not make every hand your enemy." Gideon stood near the stall door with the lantern. The words settled somewhere deeper than the barn. Marenna cleaned the cut and replaced the bandage with careful fingers. The mare leaned into her shoulder before she finished. "You know horses. I know fear." She rose, straw clung to the soaked hem of her dress. Above the next stall, a roof beam sagged from the storm. "The barn will not hold another heavy rain," Marenna observed. "I will brace it tomorrow. You will not brace that alone with your knee." His jaw tightened. "I manage." So did I, until a wagon driver left me beside the road. The truth carried no accusation. That made it harder to resist. By dawn, the storm had passed. Gideon found Marenna outside with her hair tied by the faded blue ribbon. She had changed into a dry dress from her trunk, though its shoulders had been altered to free her arms. He set biscuits and eggs on the porch table. "Eat first. I will earn it first. Food is not wages. Then give me work." Gideon studied her. Pride had kept many good people alive. It had also kept them lonely. The north beam needs lifting. Marenna looked toward the barn. That is not enough work. By midday, she had raised the beam while Gideon fitted a brace beneath it. Dust coated her arms. Sweat darkened the cloth along her back. She never boasted, never rushed him, and never used her strength to make his slower movements seem small. When his knee buckled on the ladder, her hand closed around his forearm. She steadied him without comment. Gideon disliked needing help, yet in her grip he felt no pity, only certainty. They worked until the barn stood square again. At the well, Gideon poured water over his hands. "You have earned breakfast, dinner, and perhaps ownership of the barn. I asked for a meal, not a kingdom. You bargained poorly. I was never taught to expect much. The answer stripped humor from the air. No one should have taught you that. Marenna looked toward the mountains. Longing crossed her face, then disappeared. That evening, they returned to the tin box. Gideon warmed the swollen edge near the stove while Marenna worked the key. The panel released with a dull click. Inside lay a narrow ledger wrapped in oilcloth. Marenna opened it. The pages listed cattle sales, camp wages, winter provisions, and company transfers. Near the middle, one entry had been marked twice in red pencil. Payroll withdrawal, $8,000. Below it sat the signature of Gideon Mercer. Marenna read the line again. The room seemed to shrink around them. My father carried the blame for this money. Gideon kept his eyes on the ledger. Yes, her scarred hand flattened against the page, and your name released it. Yes, the tenderness she had shown the mayor vanished behind a stillness more dangerous than anger. Marenna closed her fingers around the ledger. Did you help my father steal it? Gideon did not answer at once. The ledger lay between them like a loaded weapon. Marenna's fingers remained pressed against the page. The scar across her palm showed pale beneath the lamplight. Signed for the withdrawal, Gideon murmured. That was not my question. No. Her eyes lifted. No, you did not help him steal it. No, your father stole nothing. The words drove her back from the table. Gideon moved toward her, then stopped. Comfort offered too quickly could become another insult. Marenna closed the ledger. My father carried that shame until he could barely look at me. I know. You knew he was innocent. Gideon's thumb tapped twice against the table. I knew enough to doubt the story. That is not the same as innocence. No. Her breathing became shallow. Marenna wrapped the ledger in oilcloth. You will tell me everything. I will. When? After we go to town. A bitter laugh escaped her. You ask me to wait after nearly 20 years. The company records at the exchange may prove what my memory cannot. She studied him. You still think truth requires permission. The sentence followed Gideon into the night. By morning, Copper Creek had washed clean beneath a hard blue sky. Marenna rode beside him on a broad chestnut gelding that usually disliked strangers. Under her hands, the animal moved calmly. At the edge of town, conversations slowed. Men near the feed store watched her pass. Two women on the boardwalk pulled their children closer. Boys stared openly at the width of her shoulders and the powerful shape of her arms beneath the altered sleeves. Marenna kept her face forward. Gideon noticed her thumb rubbing the scar in her palm. He guided his horse nearer until their stirrups almost touched. You do not owe them smaller shoulders. Her hand stilled. At the mercantile, the owner glanced from Marenna to Gideon. You hiring freight hands now? Marenna is my guest. The owner gave a doubtful hum. Large guest? Gideon placed a sack of flour on the counter. Charge me for the flour. Keep your measurements to yourself. Silence spread through the store. Marenna looked at him with surprise. Outside, they loaded grain onto the wagon, and two children played beside stacked feed sacks while their mother argued over lamp oil inside. A wagon wheel clipped the platform. The sacks leaned. Gideon saw it first. Marenna! She turned. The top row shifted toward the children. Marenna crossed the distance in 3 strides. She shoved the smallest child clear, caught the other beneath one arm, and drove her shoulder under the falling weight. 6 heavy sacks collapsed against her back. Her knees bent. The platform groaned. For one breath, the street froze. Then Gideon reached her. He pulled the child from her arm while 3 men dragged the grain away. Marenna stayed braced until the last sack cleared. When she straightened, dust covered her hair and dress. The younger child clung to her boot. You are strong. Marenna lowered herself. Strong enough today. The mother rushed forward, gathering both children. Tears filled her eyes. Thank you. Marenna nodded. Across the street, a man near the saloon muttered, A woman built like that brings trouble. Gideon turned. She carried what the rest of you stood watching. The man looked away. That was how opinion began to change in small towns. First came embarrassment, then memory, then the slow shame of having judged poorly. At the telephone exchange, the clerk led Gideon toward the records room while Marenna waited near the wall box. The line rang. The clerk reached for it, but Marenna lifted the receiver first. Static hissed. A familiar voice slid through. "So Gideon brought you into town." Marenna's face hardened. "Who are you?" "The man who remembers what Mercer prefers to forget." Gideon stopped in the doorway. The caller continued. "Ask him who watched your father take the blame. Ask him who kept his land while Silas Vale lost his name." Marenna stared at Gideon. He crossed the room, but she held up one hand. The caller's breath crackled against the wire. "He was never your father's friend. He was his witness." The line went dead. Marenna lowered the receiver. Every person in the exchange had heard enough to understand. She looked at Gideon as though the floor beneath them had disappeared. "Did you watch them condemn him?" Gideon felt the town, the clerk, and the years of silence closing around him. "Yes." Marenna flinched. That evening she did not speak during the ride home. After darkness settled over the ranch, Gideon knelt beside a loose floorboard beneath his bed and lifted it free. Inside lay a sealed letter, yellowed at the edges. Marenna stood in the doorway. He held it toward her. "I wrote this to your father 18 years ago. She did not take it. Why did he never receive it?" Gideon looked at the unbroken seal. "Because I was too much of a coward to send it." Marenna finally took the letter. The paper felt fragile between her fingers, as though 18 years of fear had thinned it. Gideon remained beside the lifted floorboard, one knee against the planks, his broad shoulders bowed beneath a burden no one else could see. She broke the seal. "Silas, I signed the withdrawal because Harlan Voss ordered me to collect the winter payroll from the bank. By the time I understood what he intended, the money had already been divided. 4,000 went to the company debts. 2,000 bought medicine and a surgeon for your daughter. The rest disappeared into accounts Voss controlled. He means to place the entire theft on you. I heard the threat he made. If you refuse, he will close the mountain camps before the snow and leave 37 families without wages, food, or transport. I know why you agreed. I also know agreement under such a threat is not guilt. I should stand beside you. I am afraid I will not." Marenna stopped reading. The lamp flame trembled. Outside, wind moved through the repaired barn roof with a low wooden sigh. Her thumb pressed into the scar across her palm. $2,000. Gideon rose slowly. "You were 9 years old. Fever had damaged your lungs. The doctor in Red Hollow would not travel without payment. My father told me a church fund paid for the operation. He wanted you to grow without believing your life had ruined him." She stared at the page. Every year of hunger returned at once. Every town where Silas had been refused work. Every boarding house door closed after someone recognized his name. Every night, Marenna had watched him count coins while pretending not to notice that he had given her the larger portion of supper. "He let the world call him a thief so I could live." "Yes, and you let him." Gideon did not defend himself. "Yes." The word struck harder because he offered no excuse. Marenna crossed the room and placed the letter upon the table. Her enormous hands shook. She had imagined this moment during every mile from her father's grave. She had expected guilt, proof, perhaps anger strong enough to carry her onward. She had not expected innocence. Without the shame, she did not know what remained of the life she had built around repayment. "My father apologized to me before he died." Gideon looked toward her. For what? For failing to give me a respectable name. Her voice fractured. "He believed I had forgiven him. I never told him there was nothing to forgive." Gideon moved one step closer. "He knew you loved him." That is not the same as hearing it. Silence settled between them. Then Gideon reached into his vest and placed the cracked silver watch beside the letter. "It stopped the night my wife died. I kept it because suffering can become a kind of proof. A person begins to believe that releasing the pain would mean releasing the people tied to it." Marenna looked at the frozen hands. "You think I have done that with my father? I think you have carried his punishment because it was the last burden he left within your reach. Her eyes filled, though no tears fell. And what have you carried? An excuse dressed as remorse. He told her the rest. Harland Voss had controlled the North Fork Cattle Company, the bank notes, and the supply contracts. When Silas refused to accept blame, Voss threatened to shut every winter camp and strand the families before the mountain passes closed. Gideon had been 30 years old, newly promoted, and responsible for men whose children already lacked boots. He had convinced himself that silence protected them. Silas had disappeared before trial, leaving behind a confession written under pressure. Voss had preserved the company, paid the camps, and rewarded Gideon with permanent use of the lower ranch. The reward had tasted like ash from the beginning. "Why did you remain here?" Marenna whispered. "Because leaving would have felt like escape, and staying changed nothing." No. That answer finally opened her anger. She struck the table with her palm. The lamp jumped. "You watched him lose everything. You watched me grow beneath his disgrace. Then you waited for truth to arrive at your door because you could not walk toward it." Gideon absorbed every word. "You are right. I wanted you to deny it, I know. I wanted a villain, so did I." Her tears came then, not violently, but with the exhausted quiet of rain after thunder. Gideon did not touch her. He remained near enough that she would not be alone, and far enough that grief still belonged to her. After a long while, Marenna unfolded the remaining papers from the tin box. A legal deed rested beneath the ledger. She read the first paragraph, then the second. The lower ranch, including the house, barn, grazing land, and water rights, had been transferred by Silas Vale into trust. Ownership would pass to his surviving child when the company fraud became known. Marenna read her own name. Gideon recognized the document before she reached the final line. The ranch had never truly been his. It belonged to Marenna. By noon the next day, the deed had become impossible to hide. Gideon had wanted time. Marenna had wanted answers. Copper Creek offered neither. A bank rider arrived before breakfast with a notice bearing the seal of the county court. Harland Voss had died years earlier, but one of his creditors had purchased the remaining North Fork claims and intended to enforce them during the livestock auction. The lower ranch would be seized unless legal ownership was established before sundown. Marenna read the notice twice. "If I present the deed, the ranch becomes mine." "Yes, and if I refuse, the creditor takes it." Her gaze moved across the porch, the repaired barn, and the pasture where the injured mare grazed beneath morning light. "What happens to you?" Gideon folded the notice. "That is not your burden." She looked toward him with quiet anger. "That answer has already cost enough people their lives. They rode into town beneath a sky bright enough to make every shadow appear sharp." The county auction had filled Copper Creek with ranch families, drovers, children, and wagons. Cattle called from temporary pens. Dust hung over the fairground. A brass bell sounded each time another lot opened for bidding. Whispers followed Marenna from the hitching rail to the courthouse table. This time she did not rub the scar in her palm. The creditor stood beside the auction platform, narrow-faced and well-dressed. He lifted the old company claim for the crowd to see. The Mercer place was obtained through unpaid North Fork assets. Unless a lawful owner appears, the land will settle the debt. Gideon stepped forward. "Marenna Vale is the lawful owner." The crowd shifted. Marenna placed the deed on the table. The county clerk examined the seals, signatures, and trust language. His expression changed with each line. "This document appears valid." A murmur spread through the fairground. The creditor pointed toward Gideon. "Then Mercer occupied stolen land for 18 years. Gideon removed his hat. "No." His voice carried farther than shouting would have. "I occupied land purchased with another man's ruin." The auction yard became still. Gideon told them about the payroll, the winter camps, the threats, and Silas Vale. He did not soften his part. He did not blame youth, fear, Harland Voss, or the families he had believed he protected. I signed the withdrawal. I watched an innocent man accept disgrace. Then I mistook regret for repayment and silence for penance." Marenna stood near him, her broad shoulders rigid. The man beside the saloon called, "Why trust either of them?" her father confessed. Marenna faced the crowd. "My father confessed because powerful men made goodness look like guilt. He chose 37 hungry families over his own name." Several older ranchers lowered their eyes. One remembered receiving winter wages after expecting none. Another remembered Silas leaving town before the first snow. Truth moved through them not as thunder, but as pieces of memory finding their proper places. The creditor reached for the deed. Sentiment does not cancel debt. Before the clerk could respond, a horse screamed near the auction pens. A wagon team bolted from the loading lane. The driver had fallen beneath the seat. The reins dragged between the wheels. Ahead, families crowded the narrow passage beside the cattle rail. Gideon moved. Marenna was faster. She ran across the yard and caught the side of the wagon. Her boots tore furrows through the dust. The team dragged her several yards, but she climbed onto the wheel brace and seized the loose reins. The horses fought the bit. A child stood frozen in their path. Marenna pulled with both arms. Muscles rose along her shoulders beneath the blue dress. The left rein snapped. The wagon veered. Gideon reached the child and carried him clear as the team thundered past. Marenna wrapped the remaining rein around her forearm, planted one boot against the wagon frame, and turned the lead horse toward the open livestock lane. The wagon struck a fence post and stopped. For a moment, no one moved. Then Marenna climbed down. Blood did not show, but the rope had burned a dark line across her forearm. Dust coated her face. Her faded blue ribbon hung loose against her hair. The child Gideon had carried free ran to her. "You saved us." Marenna knelt despite her shaking legs. People saved one another today. The crowd looked at her differently after that, not because strength had made her worthy. She'd always been worthy. They looked differently because courage had forced them to confront what prejudice had hidden. The county clerk returned the deed to her. "The ranch is yours, Miss Vale." Applause began with the children. Then their parents joined. Finally, the sound spread across the fairground. Gideon watched Marenna receive what should have been justice, yet she did not smile. That night, while he checked the mare, Marenna sat at the kitchen table and signed a second document. She folded it beside the tin box, packed her dresses into the battered trunk, and tied her mother's ribbon around the handle. Keeping the ranch would cast Gideon out. Returning it would give the creditor everything. So before sunrise, Marenna chose a third path. She would surrender her claim and leave Copper Creek before Gideon could stop her. Gideon found the packed trunk beside the back door. Morning had not yet reached the windows. The kitchen lamp burned low, throwing long shadows across the floor. Marenna stood at the table in her traveling coat, one hand resting beside the folded document. Her faded blue ribbon had been tied around the trunk handle. Gideon closed the door behind him. "You are leaving." Marenna did not turn. "I was preventing the creditor from using me to take your home." He unfolded the paper. Transferred her claim to a charitable land trust outside the county. The ranch could no longer be seized for the North Fork debt, but neither Marenna nor Gideon would own it. Both would be allowed to remain only until the trust appointed another steward. "You surrendered everything. It was never mine in any way that mattered. It was your father's restitution. It was your life." Gideon set the document down with unusual force. "My life is not these boards." Marenna finally faced him. "No, it is every repair in them, every horse that looks for you at the fence. Every family that knows where to come during a storm, and you decided none of that included you." Her expression tightened. "I arrived carrying disgrace and a deed. I will not remain as another obligation." Gideon crossed the room. The old stiffness in his knee made the movement uneven, but nothing in his face wavered. "You think I offered you shelter because I owed your father. Did you not at first?" The honesty wounded more than a comforting lie. Marenna reached for the trunk. Gideon placed one hand on its lid. "Then you repaired the barn without making my weakness a spectacle. You treated a frightened mare as though her fear deserved patience. You stood before a town that had already judged you, and used your strength to save their children." His voice lowered. "The ranch did not feel empty before you came because I had forgotten what fullness was." Marenna's fingers curled against the leather handle. "Do not make gratitude sound like love. I know the difference." The room became still. Gideon removed the cracked watch from his vest. He placed it beside the surrender document. "For 12 years, I kept this stopped because moving forward felt like betrayal. Then you walked through my door, and every quiet thing I had buried began asking to live again." Marenna looked at the frozen hands. Tears brightened her eyes. "I wanted to stay." The admission came barely above breath. Gideon waited. "I wanted mornings in the barn. I wanted your coffee, though it could strip paint from a wagon. I wanted to hear you complain about the west fence and pretend your knee did not ache before rain." Her voice broke. "I wanted a life beside you before I knew whether I had any right to want it." Gideon's hand tightened over the trunk. "You had the right the moment it became your choice, and if your choice comes from guilt, it does not. You protected me before you knew me. I protected you because you stood at my door in a storm. You knew my name. I knew it. Then I learned yours." The distance between them had narrowed to one breath. Marenna looked at his mouth, then away. "What happens when remorse fades?" Gideon touched the blue ribbon tied around the handle. "Then perhaps I will still know how you kneel before a frightened animal. Perhaps I will still remember that you lift more gently than most people touch. Perhaps I will still want you at the table when the day has been hard." Her scarred palm opened beneath his hand. He covered it without gripping. The house is not shelter when you are planning to leave it. For one suspended moment, Marenna leaned toward him. A crash shattered the window. The lamp went out. Wind rushed through broken glass. A dark figure vaulted across the sill and struck Gideon from the side. He hit the table, sending the watch and papers to the floor. Marenna seized the intruder's coat. The cloth tore. A familiar voice snarled from the darkness. "You should have listened to the telephone." The caller threw a fistful of stove ash into her face. Marenna released him long enough to shield her eyes. He grabbed the tin box. Gideon lunged, but the intruder kicked his injured knee. Pain drove him down. The back door slammed. Marenna wiped ash from her eyes and ran outside. A horse thundered away from the ranch, carrying the caller toward the southern trail. "The river crossing," Gideon muttered. Marenna reached for the saddle hanging by the barn door. No, Gideon forced himself upright. The bridge was damaged by the storm. He has the only proof that can clear both families. You are not following him alone. Marenna looked at his swollen knee and made her choice. She shoved the barn bar into place between them. By the time Gideon reached the other door, she had mounted the chestnut. "Marenna." She pulled the blue ribbon from her hair and dropped it beside the fence. A folded scrap of paper was tied around it. Then she rode into the darkness. Gideon opened the message beneath the lantern. "Do not risk your life for mine." Far beyond the pasture, thunder rolled over the river. Gideon did not saddle a horse. His knee would not hold in a stirrup, and pride had already wasted too many years. He took the light wagon, tied the lantern high, and drove toward the river with Marenna's ribbon wrapped around his wrist. Rain began before he reached the southern trail. The wheels struck ruts hard enough to jar his teeth. Each jolt sent pain through his injured leg, but the greater pain came from imagining Marenna alone on the broken bridge, believing her life weighed less than a box of old papers. "No one reaches shelter alone," he muttered into the storm. The river answered with a roar. He found the chestnut near the tree line, reins trailing through mud. Beyond it, the bridge leaned over brown floodwater. One support had broken away. The middle planks dipped beneath the current whenever the river surged. Marenna stood near the center. Her boots were planted wide. Both hands gripped the leather harness of the caller's horse, which had fallen against the damaged railing. The frightened animal fought to regain its footing. On the opposite side, the dark-coated man clung to a bridge cable with one arm. The tin box rested between them. Water swept across the planks and nudged it closer to the edge. "Marenna!" She looked back. Relief crossed her face, followed by anger. You should not be here. Gideon stepped from the wagon and limped toward the bridge. You left a poor instruction. The caller twisted toward him. Lamplight revealed the narrow face of the creditor who had challenged the deed at the auction. You choose her, Mercer, and the box is gone. His free hand reached toward it. Marenna pulled the horse higher. The muscles along her arms trembled with strain. Help the animal, she ordered. Gideon moved onto the bridge. The creditor laughed through his fear. Still playing protector? Tell her why you came. Tell her you need those records more than you need her. Gideon ignored him. The horse slipped again. Marenna dropped to one knee, keeping the harness above the water. Her scarred palm had opened against a broken buckle, yet she did not loosen her hold. Gideon reached the animal's head and covered one terrified eye. Easy! The bridge groaned. The creditor lunged for the box. A surge struck the planks. His boots went out from beneath him. Marenna caught the back of his coat with one hand while still holding the horse with the other. For a moment she carried both. The man stared at her in disbelief. You came to steal my father's name, she breathed, and I will still not watch you drown. That was the strength Copper Creek had failed to understand. It was not merely the power in her shoulders. It was the refusal to let cruelty decide what kind of woman she became. Gideon pulled the horse upright. The animal scrambled towards solid ground. Marenna shoved the creditor after it, but the movement cost her balance. The box slid. So did she. One of the remaining boards broke beneath her boot. Her body dropped through the gap until both arms struck the bridge deck. Floodwater seized her skirt and dragged downward. The tin box spun beside her. Gideon reached the split in the bridge. The creditor crawled toward the box. Those papers clear your name, he shouted. Without them, the ranch claim returns. Everything you confess becomes only a story. Gideon saw the box against the railing. He saw Marenna's fingers slipping across the wet plank. For 18 years, he had wanted proof strong enough to undo his cowardice. He had imagined records, signatures, and witnesses washing the stain from his life. Now the river offered him one final bargain. Truth in one hand, Marenna in the other. He stepped past the box. Gideon dropped onto his uninjured knee and caught her wrist. The scar in her palm pressed against his fingers. Marenna, look at me. Her eyes found his through the rain. The box. Let it go. It clears your name. I know my name. Her grip weakened. He wrapped both hands around her arm. And I know yours. The tin box struck the broken rail, tipped once, and vanished into the flood. The creditor cried out. Gideon pulled until his injured knee nearly failed. Marenna found the edge with her free hand, and together they dragged her onto the bridge. For several breaths, neither moved. Then Marenna pressed her forehead against his shoulder. You chose me. Gideon held her as the river carried the evidence away. I should have chosen a person over fear long ago. Behind them, the creditor sat beside his trembling horse, defeated less by capture than by the knowledge that Marenna had saved him. By dawn, they returned to the ranch with the man secured in the wagon. The county sheriff took him at the gate after receiving word from the exchange clerk. Inside, Gideon found his cracked watch beneath the table. Marenna lifted it, wound the crown, and set the hands moving. A faint ticking filled the room. The papers are gone, Gideon murmured. Not all of them. She walked to the battered trunk and loosened the lining beneath its lid. From the hidden seam, Marenna drew a sealed envelope. Gideon recognized her father's handwriting. Across the front were 7 words. For the day you finally choose to speak. Gideon did not open the letter immediately. He carried it to the table and placed the carved cottonwood horse beside it. Marenna sat opposite him, her bandaged palm resting near the moving pocket watch. Its ticking sounded small, steady, and almost brave. At last, Gideon broke the seal. Gideon, if this reaches you, then my daughter has survived long enough to find the truth, and you have survived long enough to face it. Do not ask her to forgive what belongs to me. I forgave you years ago. You were afraid, and fear made you silent. Yet before that silence, you were the young cowboy who carried Marenna through a blizzard when her lungs were failing. You held her beneath your coat for 6 miles. You gave the surgeon every dollar in your pocket before Voss arranged the rest. You carved the horse while waiting outside the operation room. When I agreed to carry the company blame, you begged me to refuse. I would not. 37 families needed those wages. You promised that if my child ever came to your door, she would never be turned away. Keep that promise only if it remains kindness. Never turn it into a chain around either heart. Gideon stopped. Marenna touched the broken ear of the wooden horse. You carried me. You were small enough to fit inside my coat. A tear slipped along her cheek. And all these years, you believed your worst choice mattered more than your first kindness. I believed regret was the honest part of me. Marenna reached across the table. Her scarred palm settled over his hand. Then honesty was too narrow. The next morning, Gideon rode into Copper Creek beside her. The lost ledger could no longer speak, so Gideon did. He stood before the county clerk, the bank director, the ranch families, and the townspeople gathered near the auction platform. He repeated the whole truth without asking anyone to clear his name. He accepted whatever judgment followed. Then the oldest ranchers began remembering. One produced a winter pay receipt bearing the North Fork seal. Another carried a bank notice showing money transferred into a hidden Voss account. The exchange clerk linked the creditor to the threatening calls. Piece by piece, the community built the proof Gideon had once been too frightened to seek. The court rejected the creditor's claim. The remaining North Fork debts were settled through surviving company assets. Marenna retained lawful ownership of the ranch. She signed no surrender. Instead, she filed a partnership deed. Outside the clerk's office, Gideon studied the document. You divided it equally. I did. Why? Because shelter is not a debt. His eyes lifted. And because no one reaches it alone. The words broke the final restraint between them. Gideon touched her face with a tenderness that made her close her eyes. He told her that he loved her courage, her patience, her stubborn dignity, and the softness she protected beneath all that strength. Marenna confessed that she loved the man who had finally chosen the truth without demanding a reward. Their first kiss was quiet. It carried no triumph, only recognition. They married in the repaired barn at the end of autumn. Children hung lanterns from the beams Marenna had lifted. The rescued mare stood in the nearest stall with blue ribbon braided through her mane. Gideon wore the cracked watch still ticking. Marenna carried the cottonwood horse in the pocket of a pale gray dress. Life afterward did not become painless because worthy lives rarely did. Gideon's knee worsened during winter. Marenna still woke from dreams in which her father wandered beneath closed doors. Some townspeople needed years to replace prejudice with respect. Healing came through ordinary repetitions rather than miracles. Coffee before sunrise. Hands meeting over fence wire. A chair drawn nearer to the stove, an apology spoken before pride hardened. The ranch became a stopping place for travelers stranded in the pass. Everyone received soup, dry blankets, and a place near the fire. Gideon repaired harnesses while Marenna trained freight horses and taught local girls that strength did not diminish womanhood. In spring, they built a small bunkhouse for families crossing the mountains. Above its door, Gideon carved a horse with one broken ear. Years later, children asked why the carving was damaged. Marenna would open her scarred hand and explain that broken things could remain beloved. Gideon would tap the watch in his vest and add that stopped things could begin again. On quiet evenings, they sat on the porch while sunlight faded across the pasture. Her blue ribbon rested around his wrist whenever rain threatened, and his hand rested inside hers without shame. Neither forgot Silas. They spoke his name with honor. That became the truest restoration. Not land, not money, not public approval. A good man's memory no longer carried a lie, and the daughter who had inherited his burden finally inherited his courage instead. Gideon had once believed redemption required recovering the past. Marenna taught him otherwise. Redemption began when a person stopped asking whether love had been earned and found the courage to receive it honestly. The suspicious call had been meant to close a door. Instead, a giant woman stepped through it carrying the truth, and 2 wounded lives discovered that home was never merely the place that sheltered them. Home was the promise they kept for one another. This story is a fictional work created for entertainment and emotional storytelling. All characters, names, locations, organizations, events, and historical circumstances depicted in the story are imaginary or used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual people, living or deceased, or to real events is entirely coincidental. The story does not endorse violence, discrimination, intimidation, unlawful conduct, or harmful behavior. It is intended for a general family-safe audience and emphasizes compassion, dignity, accountability, forgiveness, emotional healing, and second chances.